Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. And as 2023 is rapidly disappearing, so soon will your tokens. A lot of people don't realize that the tokens inside the store from the Battle Pass will be automatically converted to bonds at 1 token equals 100 bonds on the 20th of December. So to help all of you make the best decision about what to spend your tokens on, I'm going to be rating all 9 vehicles inside the token store based on 3 different criteria. Number 1, how competitive they are. Number 2, how fun they are. And number 3, how novel they are, which will give you an overall idea of how good I think these tanks are and whether they're worth the purchase. So before we begin, let me clarify that vehicles inside the token store do seem to come back year on year, and quite often they do come back at a smaller price to allow people to play catch up on the older tanks. However, don't come back to me and be angry in 2024 if the Battle Pass no longer includes any or all of these vehicles, or if their price hasn't changed. But also, Wargaming have shown a pattern that if some of these vehicles, which are currently expensive but maybe are not so exciting, if you've got enough tokens to purchase 2 of the cheaper ones now. So firstly, I'm going to rate all 9 of these vehicles based on how competitive they are. So firstly, I'm going to rate all of these vehicles from S tier down to D tier, depending on how competitive they are. Firstly, let's take a look at the BZ58-2. This vehicle actually took me by surprise. I didn't think it was going to be that good. It just basically looks like a 50 TP from tier 9 that's just a slight bit worse with less alpha damage, and I'd say all in all a much worse hull on this tank. Because this is pretty much Wargaming taking the tier 9 Polish tech tree heavy tank turret and slapping it on a tier 7 Chinese hull, and it doesn't even have rockets. However, interestingly enough, the BZ58-2 is actually getting one of the better win ratios in this comparison, and that'll be down to just how all round this tank is. There's nothing really wrong with it. It's reasonably fast, it's got good hull down capacity with 8 degrees of gun depression, its turret is solid, its gun is solid, and importantly its alpha damage is high enough to allow it to trade well. And once you get all the field mods on this tank, its top speed limit goes up to 39 kilometers an hour, meaning that you can get around fairly efficiently like the other Polish heavies. Accordingly, with regards to this list, I'd say the BZ58-2 is going to go into the A tier for being competitive inside the game. Next, let's talk about the Char Future 4. This is one of my favorite tanks inside the game. I absolutely love this vehicle to pieces, and if you want to know exactly why, I'd thoroughly recommend going and checking out my masterclass on the Char Future 4. If you're a good player, and even if you're not, this is one of the most competitive tier 9 medium tanks that you're going to be able to get your hands on. It's got decent gun depression, better than the tier 10 Batchat. All of that tier 10 Batchat high penetration with its standard rounds and its premium rounds. And the only real downside to this vehicle is that it has a long intra-clip reload of 4 seconds between its shots. However, I feel that this means that you can drop certain modules, quite often like the vertical stabilizer, and get away with it to invest into other aspects of this tank. I love this tank. It's one of my favorites in the game, and I would thoroughly recommend everyone to consider picking this one up. It's going straight in at A tier for me. Next, it's the Lorraine 50T. This has a horrible hull, but a decent turret and a pretty okay gun. The real problem with this tank is it just has god-awful damage per minute, and there's so many competitive tier 9 heavy tanks. So unless you do end up in a perfect hull down position where you do get to use your 10 degrees of gun depression, then it can spell absolute tragedy for a horrible hull, and also the side turret on this thing gets horrendous as soon as you're not pointing your gun directly at your opponent. Accordingly, this one's going to go down into the C tier for me, but it's right on the borderline between falling down into the D tier, and I wouldn't recommend it for being competitive. Alright, next up it's the Kampfpanzer. This thing is actually packing one of the worst win ratios of any tier 9 tank. It's utterly horrendous, and when we look at the win rate difference of this vehicle, it's reducing its owner's win ratio by 3% on average. This thing is truly horrendous for a variety of reasons. Number 1, if you enter the siege mode in this tank, you basically go down to having the damage per minute of a tier 7 vehicle, and while you've got all of the accuracy, your gun handling becomes horrendous, and while your speed is way better than a Swedish tank destroyer, you're still pretty darn limited compared to a variety of other tanks. But undoubtedly the biggest problem with this tank is the 360 alpha damage that you have on it. And while its armor can be okay in certain scenarios. It just doesn't really hold up because of one of the most annoying features, and that is a flexible gun that isn't locked to the hull. And while this might be good news for when you want to aim up at your opponents, as soon as you do this, your armor becomes horrendous, which means that you're constantly having to drag your mouse down to make sure that you're putting your armor back into a position where you're not going to get auto-penned. This means that this vehicle is going straight at the D tier for competitiveness for me. It's an awful tank and I thoroughly don't enjoy it. Next up, let's talk about the Kunze-Panzer. This vehicle has hydropneumatic suspension, huge amounts of gun depression that can allow it to get 15 degrees of gun depression, albeit only when you're directly in front of the vehicle. So this should be a QuickyBaby extraordinaire tank, right? I love my gun depression on vehicles. Well, yes, until you realize you have absolutely no armor, and also the fact that the siege mode or the hydropneumatic, yeah, it is a siege mode on this tank. Again, it cripples the damage per minute, but gives it better accuracy. So what people do in this vehicle is they'll enter the siege mode to fire, leave the siege mode to be able to get the better damage per minute, and then enter the siege mode with 2 seconds left to be able to then have the accuracy prepared. And honestly, it just feels like a headache to have to min-max this tank. If you can bother to be sweaty, it can be an okay tank, but quite often it just feels like it's more hassle than it's worth. Next up, let's talk about the Cobra, which actually has one of the better win ratios in this comparison. However, you've also got to consider that the kinds of players who are playing the Cobra are amongst the best, as this is a very sweaty tank. Accordingly, this means that the Cobra's win ratio difference between the actual skill level of the players and the results that they're getting is right in the middle of the pack. And I'm going to be shoving it in the B tier with regards to how competitive it is, because unless you get that dream scenario where you firstly pony up 20,000 credits to have a magazine and you get to pen most of your shots, you just have to spend forever reloading in this tank, which can make it incredibly clunky. And while maybe this isn't the best of factors to go in for competitive nature of a tank, it is very expensive to play. Next up, the AE Phase 1, and this thing is right in the middle of the pack. I'm going to try and put it in front of the Kunze-Panzer here at the B tier with regards to being competitive. It's just a good tank for sitting hold down. It's got great pen on its standard rounds, great pen on its gold rounds. It's got 10 degrees of gun depression. When you're using its gun depression, its turret is decent as well. The vehicle is just solid on a ridgeline. The problem is when it's not on a ridgeline, then its hull becomes quite awkward. And while it can side scrape, it has this big bulge over the side that can be really awkward if your opponents decide to shoot at it. The real problem that this tank has is not so much the AE Phase 1 itself, it's that it's got so much competition at Tier 9. Lots of players would rather play their Chieftain Prototype, and while I'd say the Chieftain Prototype is actually probably worse than an AE Phase 1, it makes bonds and it makes extra credits. And considering it's so close with regards to playstyle, I would never play my AE Phase 1. I'd just take my Chieftain Prototype onto the battlefield. And if I want to be extra sweaty, there's the Concept 1B inside the American tech tree that if you do have, you'd be crazy to want to play an AE Phase 1 instead of a Concept 1B if you're a competitive player. Next up, the 7772, a tank that's so good that apparently I've put it twice. And this one might actually surprise you that the 7772 has a completely average win ratio at 49.5, but when we look at the fact that the players playing the 7772 are the worst of any of the Tier 9 reward vehicles, this means that it's actually got a very impressive win ratio difference of boosting its players' win ratio on average by 0.87. And so this vehicle gets kind of a bad name inside World of Tanks, but I really don't think it deserves it. With a top speed limit of 44 kilometers an hour once you've got all the field mods and big boy penetration both on its regular rounds and 340 gold pen, combined with an incredibly low profile which allows it to hide in so many crazy locations, this one, I think it's actually one of the best vehicles and nobody is playing it. Accordingly, I'm going to be putting this one at the A tier, and I think it's probably ahead of the BZ58-2, and the chars are ahead of the BZ58-2, I feel, as well. Finally, let's talk about the K91 PT. This vehicle has some really impressive statistics, like being able to get 40% camo rating while you're moving on this vehicle if you take an exhaust. It also has great damage per minute, and if you face hug your opponents and they can't aim down on the hull and overmatch it, it has rather good armor. The real problem with the K91 PT is that the times that you actually get to use the damage per minute feel so limited, and quite often it's just a tank with 390 alpha damage that just seems to get out traded by other big boy tank destroyers. Add to that the fact that it has really bad gold penetration at only 315, and this thing feels more like a medium tank without a turret rather than being the big boy tank destroyer that a lot of people want to play it like. Accordingly, the K91 PT is going to go down towards the C tier of this list, and I think I'll put it above the Lorraine 50T because there are definitely still reasons to want to play this vehicle, especially if you're an exceptional player. Okay, so with all of our tanks rated based on their competitive nature, now I'm going to go purely on fun. All right, so firstly, the Char Future 4. This is S tier for me. I just love this tank. It feels like a bat chat that doesn't suck. And tier 9 matchmaking is so much more fun to play than tier 10. I just love the fact that the vehicle has enough gun depression. It has armor that sometimes ricochets the enemy, and just great penetration so that I feel as if I'm so darn consistent in this tank. When you add to the fact that this vehicle has impressive camera rating of 12 while moving, you can end up doing a very proficient scouting build for this vehicle by using optics, vents, and a vision system on this tank. This is the first vehicle that I would pick on the list for fun, and it's getting an S tier for me. Next up, the BZ58-2. Honestly, this thing's gonna go down towards the C tier for me because it's just so generic. It just has no reason why I would want to actually play this tank. It doesn't have the highest alpha damage, doesn't have the best turret, doesn't have the best gun depression, doesn't have the best of anything. And it's the only BZ tank in the game that doesn't even get rockets. Wargaming, what were you thinking with this vehicle? You put in a whole nation, well, a whole new tech tree inside the Chinese nation that has rockets, and then the one that you go and have to spend 24 tokens on doesn't even come with rockets. Now, it's probably a good thing that this thing doesn't have rockets from a competitive nature, considering it has the second best win ratio of any of these vehicles, but Wargaming could have easily made some of its statistics worse in other areas and then given it rockets, which would have just actually made it kind of a tank that people would probably want to get. All right, next up, AE Phase 1. This thing for me is going right in the middle of the pack. It's decent, but I'd rather play another tank. Again, for all the reasons with regards to this being competitive, I would rather play a better tank like the Concept 1B, or I'd rather play something that makes credits like the Chieftain prototype. Next up, Cobra. You know what? When it goes well, this thing would be above S tier. It would be kind of like God tier for the Cobra. But when it goes wrong, you end up losing tens of thousands of credits in a battle and probably feeling quite salty by the end of it. Accordingly, I'm going to put it in the A tier because I do think that this thing is filthy fun, and being able to deal 1,950 damage quite reliably in 4.5 seconds is disgusting. This tank also scales really well with equipment and crew skills and the field mods. If you tried this tank and it sucked, try and get all of the field mods. It might be a big ask on the tank, but once you get that final field mod that reduces the bloom after firing, this thing becomes disgusting. Also, use the turbo/rotation device combo for the experimental equipment because this thing is too slow and it needs a turbo, certainly. But anything that you can do on this tank to reduce the bloom after firing makes this thing become really gnarly. All right, next let's talk about the Kunze-Panzer. I'm dropping this one straight in the C section. For me, it's just so frustrating with the siege mode that I really think that this tank is more of a headache than it's actually worth, at least for me personally. However, some of you out there might find that having 15 degrees of gun depression makes this tank really, really exciting. And if that's you, then you should probably put this one higher up on your list. But for me, I'd rather play something like a Leopard prototype, just not have the siege mode at all, and just have a much better gun on a medium tank. Now let's talk about the Lorraine. This vehicle's going in at the D tier for me. It's just really frustrating with how the Halummer works. And you feel like unless you get into those magical situations like you're playing on Lakeville, and you go and you sit in the valley and you get all of your opponents right in front of you, and they all take it in turns to be able to come up and then slowly get drained by your terrible damage per minute, then it's not really going to work out. Funnily enough, when things do go well for this tank, it actually is a pretty strong performer. But all in all, it's still not fun, and there are far more interesting and better tanks that you can play at tier 9. Next up, the Kampfpanzer project. This thing is going right at D tier. I'm really surprised by this tank. When I played it, I thought, well, actually no, when I played it, I knew it sucked. But when I was looking at the tank statistics, I was thinking, wow, I love my Swedish tank destroyers, and I can play like a UDES at tier 9, and it has some armor, so I can do some brawling and stuff, but oh no, it's totally not worth it. This thing needed at least 390 alpha damage for it to even be remotely competitive in the game. It's a disgusting tank. It's more frustrating than it's worth, and Wargaming need to make some big changes to this tank to make it even remotely fun to play. Next up, the K91 PT. I'm actually putting this one at B tier. I think it's quite fun. If you're a sneaky player and you put a camo build on this vehicle, I like to use vents, gun rammer, and exhaust on this tank for actually one of my builds. And the other one I'm using vents, gun rammer, and durability for when I'm playing close quarters combat on city maps. This thing can actually be quite evil. Great camo, good damage per minute for a tier 9 vehicle, and as long as you don't need big alpha and big pen, it can be pretty solid. And I kind of enjoyed this tank. Next up, the 7772. This thing is going into C tier for me for an enjoyment value, because while I think it is competitive, I just don't really see a point of playing it that much. There are far better vehicles that I could be spending my time on, and I'd honestly rather drop down to tier 8 and play something like a KV-5 if I want to do any Soviet crew training. But look, it is one of the more competitive vehicles, so again, just because it's not fun doesn't mean you shouldn't go for it. All right, with all the fun said and done, let's reset this list and take a look at how novel each of these vehicles are. So firstly, the K91 PT. This is a sneaky tank destroyer. There aren't too many sneaky tank destroyers in the game now that Wargaming have changed the way that the line that led up towards what used to be the 263 was. Originally, the SU-101 was kind of sneaky and high damage per minute vehicle. And this thing, it doesn't really have too many competitors within that regard. I'd say for like a novel perspective, I'd put it in the B zone. Next up, let's talk about the Cobra. This thing, I think honestly, it's S tier with regards to its novel nature. There's nothing like this vehicle. It is the highest burst damage inside the game. And the fact that it's got 3 different flavors of ammunition with 3 different alpha damages just adds to the attraction of this vehicle from something that's just truly different. Nothing really plays like the Cobra. Whether that's a good thing or not will come down to you as a player. But for me, as somebody who likes quirky, weird tanks, the Cobra is one of the tanks that I'd definitely keep in my garage. Next up, the Char Future 4. This thing's going at A tier for me with regards to how novel it is, because not many autoloaders that have such a long intra-clip reload can still be fun or exciting to play. When I play the Char Future 4, when I get into a tier 7 matchup, my armor is legitimately not a joke. It's so bizarre to me to have a Char Future 4 that is going to be packing now 220 millimeters of armor. And while that isn't going to work against the 264 millimeters of protection that the Char Future 4 has, if I was to compare it to, for example, I don't know, let's put it against a T-43, for example. What? You've got great turret armor against a T-43 and now you can sit hull down against them unless they get lucky and they hit your top bar? Also, you can kind of even side scrape in those kind of situations against tier 7 mediums because of this. Of course, as soon as they load gold, then your turret starts to struggle more. It just makes the tank so novel when you get into a nice matchup. And when you get into a horrible matchup, well, now you can use all of that meaty penetration on both your premium rounds and your regular rounds to be a pseudo support / pseudo assassin tank. And being able to do 1,560 damage in 12 seconds is no joke, considering how long it takes to be able to unload the Batchat at tier 10. I would so rather play down a tier at tier 9 with better gun depression and just have a great time with it. So next up, AE Phase 1. With regards to being novel, I think it's either going to be in the C or the D tier. I'll probably put it the C tier. There are so many other vehicles that do exactly what this tank does. The Chieftain prototype and the Concept 1B, as well as a whole variety of other tier 9 heavy tanks like the Conqueror and the M103 inside the tech tree. they're all pretty much the same thing. You have a pretty mediocre hull, a great turret, you sit hull down, you click the enemy tanks, whatever. But still, this one, it definitely gets the job done on a ridgeline. Next up, the Kunzepanzer. This one's going to go A tier for me for being different, because there aren't many tier 9s that have a siege mode. However, the way that it's implemented, it's whether it's actually fun and competitive rather than it just being novel for the tank. But from a different collector's perspective, the Kunzepanzer is one of the best on this list. Next up, the 7772. Again, this one's going to go into the C tier for me. It's just like a generic tier 9 Soviet heavy. It gets the same gun as the T10, it gets the same gun as the STI. Oh no, I called it the STI, I meant the ST1. There are a million different tanks inside the game that just do what the 7772 does, and that is you've got a good turret, you hide the lower plate, hopefully on some rubble, and you just grind out your opponents. And for the BZ-58-2 as well. In fact, I'm going to put the BZ-58-2 down at the D tier for it being novel. Why? Because it's the hull of a tier 7 tech tree that's already in the game, with the turret of a tier 9 tech tree that's already in the game, with a gun that doesn't do anything different at all. There's no real point of owning this vehicle, I feel, from that regard. Lorraine 50T, I'll probably put it up on the C tier with regards to it being novel, purely because of the pain that it can be able to inflict on its owners. You take the worst aspect of the AMX 5120, or better to say the Lorraine, and then you put like a fairly novel turret on it, but don't give it even a special gun, no autoloader. It's a stinker, really, with all regards. Now, this is an interesting one. The Kampfpanzer. I mean, this vehicle is novel. It's really novel, actually. I'd probably put it up in the A tier. Not quite the S tier, because you could go and play one of the Swedish tank destroyers, and I think you'll have more fun playing a Swedish tank destroyer than you will do having this vehicle. But again, look at me bringing in the fun into a novelty section of this tank. Look, it's A tier. It's different enough. It's an absolute freak. It's one that the collectors probably would want to have, but would they actually want to play it rather than have it just gathering dust inside their garage? So now comes to my overall rating, which is going to be taking into account the different values that we've assigned to how competitive, fun, and novel the different tanks are. So, firstly, the 7772. Purely from being a competitive tank, I think this one has to go into the B tier. It's arguably one of the best tanks in this comparison for smashing your opponents, or at least just being effective in a wide variety of scenarios, you know, Soviet balance and all of that. But with regards to how fun and novel it is, it definitely brings the tank down. Next up, we're going to look at the Kunzepanzer, which I think is right in between the A and the B section. If you think that the hydro pneumatic suspension and the siege mode looks fun on this tank, then this one's probably going up towards the A tier. But for me personally, because I feel like it's so clunky, I'm going to put it down into the B tier. Next up, the Char Future 4. And look, this might be a little bit of QuickyBaby bias, but I'm putting the Char Future up into the S tier. I absolutely love this tank. I think it's fun. I think it's pretty novel. I think it's pretty darn competitive. And if you're a very good player, this will actually be one of the most competitive tanks in this comparison. I think even the casual players who get this vehicle will enjoy its friendly magazine and great pen, and the hyper-competitive players will love that it provides all of the fun of the Bat Chat, just with a better package at a lower tier. And considering it's only 9 tokens, I think this is the first one I would recommend for everyone. Next up, the Lorraine 50T. This one's going to go into the C tier for me. That hull armor is just absolutely unforgivable on this tank, but it's not so awful that I would put it into the D tier section. It is a pretty forgettable vehicle, and it's one of the last ones that I would actually bother spending points on, and I do expect that next year it's probably going to get cheaper, so you might be able to get it at a better price in 2024. Next up, the BZ-58-2. This one suffers a bit like the 7772, where it is a competitive tank, but it's not very fun, and it's certainly not very novel. Accordingly, I'll put it behind the 7772, especially considering that it's actually 24 tokens right now. I think you're going to have a lot more fun picking one of the other vehicles that you don't have, and this is one of the last ones that I would bother spending my tokens on. Next up, the AE Phase 1. This thing is just so darn consistent. I'm going to put it behind the Kunzepanzer, but before the 772 and the BZ-58-2, purely because it's quite cheap, and I think everyone should be able to get their hands on this vehicle. It's an easy pickup. However, once again, I want to reiterate, if you have a Chieftain prototype, there's pretty much no point in playing this vehicle past getting your Marks of Excellence or an Ace Tanker. So if you already have the Chieftain prototype or the Concept 1B, you might want to skip the A Phase 1 and spend your tokens elsewhere. Next, the K91 PT. I'm going to put this before the A Phase 1 after the Kunzerpanzer in the B tier, because this thing just has such a variety with how you can play. Get on a city map, then whack durability, gun rammer on it, and just go and try and phase hug or just grind out your opponents. Or you get on a sneaky map, you can practically be a medium tank or a light tank with regards to how well this thing can scout, and it can dump in some damage at long range. Again, the only thing that really holds this thing back is the penetration and the alpha, but if you can work around that and just pretend like you're a medium tank without a turret, you will do well in this tank. Next up, the Cobra. This one's going in at A tier for me. Now, if credits aren't a concern for you, this one might even be S tier. If you don't mind losing 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 credits a game because you're like, ha 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 ha, it completely eviscerated any tank at tier 9 or tier 10 in a single magazine, then this one can be fun. I would thoroughly not recommend this for the free-to-play players, because honestly, if you think you're going to do well by only having 360 alpha, and fair enough, still doing 1,440 in 4.5 seconds is good, but this is really one for all the pay-to-win players who are willing to spend 17,000 credits per magazine to deal 1,960 damage in 4.5 seconds. And finally, the Kampfpanzer III Project 07 HK. This one is D tier for me. I would thoroughly recommend you avoid it. Not only is it the most expensive vehicle in this year's Battle Pass at 27 tokens, you could go and get yourself 3 vehicles. You could get yourself a 7772, an AE Phase 1, and a Chaff U Tier 4 for the price of this tank. It is bonkers. You'll be left with an absolute stinker inside your garage. And again, the only thing that was actually good about this vehicle is just how novel it is. However, let me tell you, that novelty wears off pretty darn quick, and then you're just going to end up being very frustrated with a vehicle that's got a clunky siege mode, a hydro pneumatic suspension that you feel like you have to mother like it's a newborn, and all in all, a D grade tank. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, there you have it. I have rated all 9 of the reward vehicles from this year's Battle Pass. I really hope this was useful for you and helps you to be able to choose what to spend those tokens on. If it was, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And once again, let me remind you that if you do not spend your tokens by the 20th of December, they will be automatically turned into bonds. So unless you'd rather have the bonds to spend on something else, I thoroughly recommend getting these tanks. And let me know in the comments whether you agree or disagree with the different ratings that I have applied to these tanks. Which vehicle are you going to pick up and which ones are on your must-have list? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.